Welcome to the moment the impossible happened, when the frozen fields of Bastogne trembled beneath the roar of engines that were never supposed to be there. December 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A place swallowed by snow, silence, and despair. For 6 endless days, the 101st Airborne had been trapped, encircled by the German onslaught, outnumbered, outgunned, starving, freezing. No food, no fuel, no hope. The German command believed the trap was sealed, that Bastogne would fall, that the last American stronghold in the Ardennes would be erased before Christmas. But then, from the south, came a sound no one could explain at first, a deep metallic growl echoing across the white hills. Something alive, something monstrous. Patton's tanks were coming. They said it was impossible. The maps said it couldn't be done. The terrain frozen solid, the snow waist-deep, the roads buried beneath ice and wreckage. The German officers laughed when they first heard the rumor, Patton. Here in this weather, but the laughter froze in their throats as the thunder grew louder. Steel treads grinding through ice, diesel smoke cutting through the snow. Voices shouting from Sherman turrets, "Keep moving, don't stop for anything." It wasn't a rescue, it was resurrection. Inside Bastogne, men huddled in foxholes, rifles jammed, hands bleeding, staring at the horizon, thinking it was another bombardment. Then through the fog, the unmistakable outline of a white star, painted on olive drab, an American tank roaring toward them through enemy lines. The defenders couldn't believe it. One private later wrote, "It sounded like heaven had gears." Patton had promised to do the unthinkable, to turn his entire Third Army north in the dead of winter, pivot 90 degrees across frozen terrain, and break the German ring before Bastogne fell. It should have taken weeks. He did it in less than 72 hours. Commanders called it suicide, meteorologists called it madness, but Patton called it destiny. And as his armored columns thundered forward, each tank left behind a trail of shattered ice and disbelief. The Germans had prepared for blizzards, not miracles. Their generals clung to maps drawn in arrogance. They hadn't accounted for a man who prayed for clear skies, ordered chaplains to write a weather prayer, and told his soldiers, "When you're short of everything but enemy, you're in combat." The result? A rupture in the logic of war. A break in the rhythm of winter. The unbreakable became undone. Bastogne. The town the Germans thought they had buried suddenly roared back to life, its church bells tolling over the thunder of engines and gunfire. Imagine the sound diesel mixed with hymn snow hissing under treads, the metallic clang of hope returning. The men inside Bastogne began to rise from their foxholes, shaking the frost from their coats. They could hear the tanks before they could see them, and with each second the sound grew louder, closer, relentless. One medic wrote in his journal, "It was as if the earth itself decided to fight back." For the Germans, it was confusion, disbelief, then panic. A colonel shouted, "Impossible! They're coming from the south!" Another screamed, "Those roads are impassable!" But Patton's men didn't care. They had chains on their treads, torches on their backs, and the fury of a general who refused to wait for spring. By the time the first Sherman tank burst through the fog at the outskirts of Bastogne, even the snow seemed to tremble. The German lines fractured like glass. Soldiers who had once shouted Sieg Heil now whispered Rückzug, retreat. The battlefield became a blizzard of chaos. American tank destroyers slicing through panzer columns, artillery shells lighting up the frozen woods, and amid it all, the voice of Patton, calm and sharp. "We're not holding Bastogne. We're relieving it." And that's how history shifted, not with diplomacy, not with negotiations, but with a column of frozen mud-stained tanks moving faster than physics allowed, guided by a general who refused to believe in the word impossible. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a statement. A message sent through snow and steel that audacity could rewrite fate. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Tell me what you hear in your mind right now. The rumble of engines, the hiss of snow, the breath before a miracle. Because tonight you're not just watching history, you're standing in it. The moment when the Germans were shocked, the frozen forest broke open and Patton's tanks roared into legend. December 19th, 1944, southern Belgium. The world had turned white and gray. The Ardennes lay buried beneath a silence so heavy, it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Every sound carried a distant crack of rifle fire, a boot scraping over ice, the faint murmur of engines somewhere beyond the fog. The forest that had once been a quiet haven for loggers and hunters was now a labyrinth of snow and fir trees shattered by shells, branches heavy with frost, foxholes filled with men who hadn't slept in days. In the town of Bastogne, the air smelled of smoke and cordite, of pine trees burning, of wool uniforms soaked in blood and sleet. The 101st Airborne Division, hastily thrown into the line after days of marching, had dug in not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. They were surrounded on all sides, 7 German divisions, pressing in like a tightening fist. To the north, German armor rolled through the frozen roads of Noville, their treads grinding over the remains of American trucks. To the south, the Panzer-Lehr division closed in from Wiltz, its tigers prowling through the smoke. Every direction was a trap. The 101st paratroopers, trained to drop from the sky and strike swiftly, were now immobile, frozen to the ground. Their radios crackled with fragments of despair. "We're cut off. Need ammo. Need fuel." Yet command at Luxembourg refused to say the words aloud and circled. It was a word that meant death, and they weren't ready to pronounce it yet. Inside Bastogne, chaos had become routine. The wounded lay in the basements of shattered houses, bandages frozen stiff, morphine running low. Civilians, their homes obliterated, wandered the streets like ghosts. A Belgian farmer wrapped in rags offered coffee brewed from melted snow. The soldiers called it Bastogne blend. They laughed when they drank it, but no one smiled. In the distance, the low rhythmic boom of German artillery never stopped. Every few minutes, another shell, another building, another scream. The sky hung low, a gray ceiling pressing down on everything. The snow had turned red in places, brown in others. The Germans had planned this, the Ardennes offensive, a desperate gamble to split the Allied lines. Capture Antwerp and force peace on their terms. Hitler called it Wacht am Rhein, the watch on the Rhine. But to the men in Bastogne, it was just the storm. They called it the Big Freeze. And in that freeze, every moment mattered. Every breath was borrowed time. On the German side, confidence ran high. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of Wavre Panzer Corps, watched through his binoculars as his armor columns snaked through the forest. He believed Bastogne would fall in 48 hours, that the Americans, ill-equipped for winter, would crumble under pressure. His men carried leaflets printed by Goebbels' propaganda ministry, "Surrender, and live resistance is useless." They dropped them over the town in the morning wind. The paratroopers burned them for warmth. At the same time, far to the south in Luxembourg, General George S. Patton was already studying the impossible. The situation reports came in like shards of bad news. The German breakthrough in the Ardennes was deeper than anyone expected. The Allied front fractured. Bastogne was surrounded. Eisenhower's staff wanted to hold defensive positions, wait for the weather to clear, plan a counterattack in January. But Patton didn't believe in waiting. He stood before his staff, slammed his fist on the table, and said, "We're going to turn north and attack immediately." His officers stared in disbelief. The Third Army was facing east, engaged with the Germans near Saarlauturn. To pivot north over 200 miles through snow mud and shattered bridges was lunacy. But Patton didn't blink. "We'll do it in 3 days," he said. "Tell the chaplain to pray for good weather. We'll need clear skies for the Air Corps." The men laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Back at Bastogne, the defenders clung to what little they had. Rations were nearly gone. The ammunition dumps were frozen solid. The medical teams were improvising with strips of cloth torn from parachutes. Colonel McAuliffe, commanding in place of the division's absent general, moved from post to post checking on his men. "We hold," he told them, "no matter what." The words sounded brave, but the math was against them. 70,000 Germans against 15,000 Americans, supported by 400 tanks and 2,000 artillery pieces. The 101st had none. Still, they dug deeper. They strung wire through trees, laid mines along the roads, and whispered jokes about how they'd already spent Christmas in worse places, though no one could think of one. The nights were endless. Temperatures dropped below freezing frostbite, spreading faster than bullets. Some men wrapped their feet in gun-cleaning rags, others tore up curtains from ruined houses. A few lit candles inside their helmets to thaw their hands. Every few hours, a messenger arrived from the perimeter with grim updates. They're probing again. Another assault at Noville. We're running low on shells, and always the same question. When will the tanks come? No one knew. No one even believed rescue was possible anymore. Above them, the sky remained their enemy. The overcast had settled like a curse, grounding Allied air support, blinding reconnaissance, freezing the world in place. Patton's request for a weather prayer had become a dark joke among his men. But he kept repeating it. "The Lord will clear the skies," he said. He's an old soldier. He knows what's needed. And then, on the morning of December 23rd, something shifted. The wind cut cold and sharp, blowing the fog away. For the first time in a week, the sun pierced the clouds, a single beam of light striking the snowbound town like a spotlight on a stage. The soldiers inside Bastogne looked up and saw blue sky, fragile, unreal, but there. Within hours, C-47s appeared overhead, dropping supplies and ammunition by parachute. Men cheered, waving their helmets in the air. One wrote later, "It was the first time I believed we might live." But even with supplies, the situation remained desperate. The Germans attacked again that night, tanks rolling through the dark, infantry screaming fire as they charged. The Americans held by inches. In one sector, a machine gun crew fired until the barrel melted, then threw grenades with bare hands. They were running out of everything except will. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, Patton's columns were already moving engines, groaning tracks, biting into the ice, men wrapped in blankets and determination. They were racing toward a name that had become a prayer, Bastogne. The stage was set a frozen town, an army on the brink, a general defying reason. The world believed the Germans had victory in their grasp. But history was about to turn on a road slick with ice and faith. The question was no longer whether Bastogne would fall, but how fast salvation could move through snow. December 24th, 1944. The frozen heart of the Ardennes pulsed with equations of war. Every hour, every shell, every gallon of fuel carried a number, and the numbers spoke one truth. Bastogne should have fallen. By logic, by math, by physics, it was impossible for the 101st Airborne to hold. The Germans had 75,000 men encircling 15,000 defenders. They had 400 tanks against none. They had 16 times the artillery, double the air reconnaissance, and an entire logistical network still functioning deep within the Reich. And yet, something was breaking in the arithmetic. Something human, unpredictable, was rewriting the math of the battlefield. The U.S. War Department's own records, written weeks later, would call it a statistical anomaly. But in that moment on that frozen front, it wasn't a mystery. It was survival-defying geometry. The Office of Naval Intelligence recorded the German fuel situation 90% depleted. Hitler's final gamble, the Ardennes offensive, had begun with 2,000 tanks, 2,000 planes, and 400,000 men. But by the fourth day, the Luftwaffe had lost 344 aircraft to the weather and Allied counterattacks. The panzer columns that had surged like black tides toward Antwerp were slowing not because of resistance, but because their engines were dying in the cold. The temperature had dropped to -20. Fuel turned to sludge. Diesel froze. Steel snapped like bone. Patton's staff journals detail the distances, 150 miles of frozen roads between his Third Army's spearhead and Bastogne. Under normal conditions, such a movement pivoting an entire army 90 degrees in midwinter would take 2 weeks. Patton gave them 3 days. His tanks consumed 100,000 gallons of gasoline per day, yet supply convoys barely existed. The Red Ball Express routes had been shattered by snow. The fuel came by hand GIs carrying jerry cans across bridges that creaked under frost. One truck driver wrote, "We didn't drive by headlights. We drove by the sound of the tanks ahead." The Germans thought logistics was on their side. The Wehrmacht had planned Wacht am Rhein with the precision of an engineer. They believed that by cutting off Allied supply lines, they would choke the enemy into collapse. They didn't account for the American machine's adaptability. In less than 48 hours, U.S. engineers rebuilt 5 major bridges along Patton's route. Bulldozers plowed through snowdrifts higher than men. Telephone lines were strung mid-battle. The 4th Armored Division, the tip of Patton's spear, moved at an average of 25 miles per hour through terrain the Germans had declared impassable. Inside Bastogne, the math of endurance was even more brutal. Ammunition was rationed by seconds. Each artillery battery was down to 6 shells per gun per day. Mortar rounds were counted like coins. The 326th Medical Company logged 643 casualties with no plasma and no morphine, only snow packed against wounds. The temperature inside aid stations dropped to 20 degrees. A nurse recorded, "We kept our patients alive by lying beside them." And yet, somehow the casualty ratio remained nearly 1-to-1, American losses matching German, despite being surrounded. That defied all expectations of siege warfare. In the War Department's January 1945 analysis, one line was underlined twice. Enemy attrition exceeded projected ratios by 42%. The conclusion was simple. The Germans were burning faster than they could advance. Fuel wasn't their only flaw. Communication had collapsed. American radio intercept units picked up garbled transmissions from German field HQs, static confusion, anger. One message read, "Our lines are broken, requesting armor support, no fuel." Another, more desperate. The snow fights against us. In a war that had always favored order, the Ardennes was devouring logic itself. At Patton's command post, maps covered the walls, thick red arrows bending northward, tracing the impossible maneuver. Each arrow represented a column of men grinding forward through blizzards. The 26th Infantry Division advanced by night with blackout lights, guided only by the glow of tracers in the distance. The 80th Division followed their vehicles wrapped in white sheets for camouflage. Mechanics worked by candlelight, stripping frozen engines, thawing them with torches. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was faith made mechanical. Reports from the German side painted a mirror image of disbelief. Panzer Lehr's after-action log, recovered in February, described unexpected resistance and unusual American counter-mobility. One commander scribbled in the margin, "They are moving through the storm as if it were clear." Another wrote simply, "Der Teufel führt sie." The devil leads them. The contrast between the two armies had never been sharper. The Germans relied on precision timetables, fuel estimates, weather charts. The Americans relied on momentum. Keep moving, keep improvising, never stop. Patton's orders were reduced to 4 words, repeated endlessly. Hold, move, kill, pray. That prayer, written days earlier by Chaplain James O'Neill, was recited across every column. Almighty and most merciful Father, grant us fair weather for battle. Restrain these immoderate rains and mists. Give us courage and victory. Soldiers whispered it in their tanks, their jeeps, their foxholes. Some mocked it. Some cried it. But when the skies cleared on December 23rd, even the cynics stared upward in silence. The Air Corps struck within hours, 240 P-47 Thunderbolts pounding German armor trapped in the valleys. One pilot radioed, "The sky's ours again, boys." From that moment, the data inverted. The tide reversed. Every metric that had once favored the Germans began to collapse. Supply loss up 68%. Armor mobility down 52%. Air cover 0. Meanwhile, Patton's advance rate increased by 35% despite worsening weather. The Third Army had become a force that broke equations, the embodiment of logistics outpacing reason. By Christmas Eve, American reconnaissance spotted the first flashes of their own artillery within 10 miles of Bastogne. The signal went out over encrypted radio. "We're close enough to hear them breathe." McAuliffe's men inside the town intercepted it, and for the first time, someone dared to believe rescue might be real. But for the Germans, disbelief turned to horror. Von Lüttwitz received reconnaissance reports of Patton's armor on the southern roads and refused to believe them. His staff insisted that the American Third Army was still engaged near Saarlautern. "It's a deception," he said. "They cannot move that fast." His aide replied, "They already have." Fact by fact, hour by hour, the impossible was materializing. The equations no longer held. The frozen forest was alive with noise again. The rhythmic grind of engines, the metallic clatter of treads, the echo of men rewriting what military science said could not be done. By the end of December 24th, one simple truth had replaced the logic of war. The Germans were no longer attacking. They were reacting. December 24th, night fell without color. The snow was blue in the moonlight, the smoke gray, the faces pale and hollow like carved stone. Somewhere along the southern perimeter of Bastogne, near a hamlet called Marvy, two paratroopers crouched in a slit trench barely wide enough for breath. Their names were Private First Class Robert Red Simmons and Sergeant Joe Banning, 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. They hadn't eaten since dawn. Their last cigarette was half a day ago, stubbed out and shared in silence. Above them, the sky crackled with distant thunder. Not weather, not God, artillery. Red's hands were numb. He could no longer feel the trigger of his Garand. He'd tied his fingers with wire so they wouldn't freeze straight. Joe leaned close, whispering, "You hear that?" Red nodded. It was faint, a low mechanical growl miles away, almost buried beneath the wind. "Sounds like armor," Joe said. German Red didn't answer. Hope was a dangerous thing in Bastogne. The snow fell heavier. Every breath burned. Somewhere behind them, a medic was crying softly, not from fear, but exhaustion. The men had long stopped distinguishing between noise and silence. Everything was a hum. The earth hummed, the sky hummed, even their bones hummed. When a flare burst above the trees, Red flinched for an instant. The whole forest glowed green, the snow reflecting the flare's eerie light. He saw the outlines of bodies frozen in the drifts, some American, some German, their faces tilted skyward, snow masking their eyes. Then came the voices, German sharp barking through the dark. Los, the enemy was close. Red tightened his grip. He could see their silhouettes now, gray shadows moving, low rifles slung. Joe tapped his shoulder, mouthed, "Wait." They waited until the first figure stepped into range. Two shots cracked sharp surgical, and the forest erupted. Muzzle flashes strobed between trees. Snow sprayed up like dust. Red fired until his clip pinged empty, then reloaded with trembling hands. Joe shouted, "Hold the line," though there was no line, only chaos and ice. When the attack faded, silence fell again. But it wasn't peace. It was absence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own pulse. Red looked down, blood in the snow, dark and steaming. Joe was hit in the leg, torn through by shrapnel. "Leave it," he muttered. "Ain't bad." But the wound wouldn't stop bleeding. Red ripped his scarf and pressed it down. The blood soaked through in seconds. Joe smiled through his teeth. "Merry Christmas, huh?" They laughed because there was nothing else to do. The laughter froze in their throats. Somewhere down the road, a church bell rang one soft, accidental toll. Maybe the wind. Maybe someone's trembling hand. But it cut through the cold like a heartbeat. At dawn, the Germans attacked again, tanks. This time Panzer IVs grinding forward through the drifts. The snow muffled their movement, but the ground shook with each step. Red and Joe were still in the trench when the first shell hit. The blast buried them in snow. When Red clawed his way out, his helmet was gone, his ears ringing. The forest was gone, just stumps and smoke. He could see one of the panzers burning its crew, scrambling out flames, licking their coats. American bazooka men had ambushed them from behind a barn. One of them shouted, "They're pulling back," and for a heartbeat, the world tilted toward survival. But Bastogne was still dying by inches. Every man knew it. Inside the town, in the old seminary converted into a hospital, hundreds of wounded lay in rows on the cold floor. Candles flickered in wine bottles. The walls were cracked, the windows boarded. A nurse named Anna Belgian, 21 years old, moved between bodies, her shoes crunching on frost. She whispered to each man, French, English, German, it didn't matter. She spoke as if language itself could hold them together. Sleep. It's almost over. That morning, a German messenger arrived under a white flag. He carried a letter for Colonel McAuliffe, a demand for surrender, signed by General von Lüttwitz himself. The paper was clean, formal, almost polite. To the U.S. commander of Bastogne, there is only one honorable alternative: surrender or face annihilation. The colonel read it once, looked up and smiled. Aw, nuts. He handed it back. The answer spread through the ranks within the hour. Nuts. The men laughed until they cried. It wasn't courage, it was exhaustion, made holy. Back on the line, Red and Joe heard the news secondhand. Joe smirked. Nuts. That's it. Red nodded. That's it. They didn't need more. The word became a talisman. Men carved it into the stocks of their rifles. Someone painted it on a broken door. For the rest of the siege, it hung in the air like a promise, simple, absurd, unbreakable. By Christmas night, Joe's wound had blackened. The medics couldn't reach him. Red stayed beside him, feeding him snow to drink. You think they'll come? Joe whispered. Red didn't answer. He listened. Somewhere out there in the darkness beyond the lines, the wind carried a faint metallic rhythm, treads on ice, faint but real. Joe's eyes flickered open. You hear that? Red nodded. Yeah, Joe smiled. Told you it wasn't German. The night stretched on. Snow kept falling soft and endless. Red leaned back against the frozen wall of their trench rifle across his knees, watching the horizon for a glow that might be headlights or just the moon. His eyelids sank. The rumble grew louder. When morning came, the sun broke through thin clouds, a pale light spilling over Bastogne's ruins. In the distance, far beyond the line of trees, Red saw it, the first Sherman tank cresting the hill, its turret glinting like a beacon. Men began shouting. The medics dropped their stretchers, the nurses ran to the windows, the wounded tried to stand. The impossible had found them. Joe stirred his breath, ragged. I knew it, he whispered. Then he closed his eyes. Red didn't cry. He just watched the tanks roll closer, slow, deliberate, the white star clear against the olive drab. The sound filled the valley, drowning everything else. In that sound was victory and loss, and the echo of every prayer whispered in the dark. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Bastogne was still surrounded, still scarred, but something had shifted. The air itself seemed lighter. The town was alive. The men were alive. And as Patton's lead elements pushed through the final German cordon, the soldiers of Bastogne realized they had outlasted the storm. For the first time in days, they exhaled. For the first time, they believed in morning again. December 25th, 1944. Christmas morning, and the snow no longer fell softly. It exploded upward. With every shell it churned beneath, treads it sang like iron. What had begun as a siege was becoming a reversal of gravity itself. Everything that once pressed down on Bastogne was now collapsing inward under its own weight. The Germans had built the trap, but Patton had found the hinge, and he was breaking it open. From the southern line, the 3rd Army's spearhead, the 4th Armored Division, advanced faster than any armored unit had ever moved in winter. Their radios hissed with static and prayer. Every mile north was a miracle wrestled from mud frost and fuel fumes. They had been told the roads were impassable. The roads disagreed. At dawn, the temperature was still below -15. Engines coughed, tracks groaned, men poured hot coffee directly into carburetors to warm them. The snowbanks glowed with reflected light tracer rounds, slicing through the white. The advance formed a rhythm move, fire repair move again. In 3 days, they covered ground no one had planned for. The Germans had measured terrain, Patton measured will. Fact by fact, the tables turned. On December 21st, the German army had controlled 800 square miles of territory across the Ardennes. By December 26th, they controlled less than half that. Allied field reports logged the shift as accelerated regression. American artillery had increased its output by 240% within 72 hours, thanks to the reopening of the Arlon supply line. Every shell counted, and every shell found something. German fuel dumps erupted in orange blooms against the gray sky. Bridges the Wehrmacht thought frozen beyond use were suddenly alive with Shermans thundering across them. The Wehrmacht had been the engineers' army, mechanical, methodical, mathematical. But now, its numbers were betraying it. The Panzer Lehr Division reported fuel at critical zero. The 2nd Panzer Division abandoned 40 tanks on the road to Neufchâteau, their engines dead. The Luftwaffe, already grounded by weather, now faced skies so clear the Allied pilots could finally see everything. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings returned like hawks to an open field. They tore through the German convoys, trains, trucks, staff cars, each explosion etching a new equation in fire. Outflanked. That was the word in every German after-action report. Patton's columns were moving too wide, too fast, cutting through forest routes never charted. They bypassed resistance struck from angles that didn't exist on maps. The Germans had drawn straight lines. Patton moved in arcs. Outproduced. That was the reality behind it. America's factories had built more tanks in 1944 than Germany had built in the entire war. Detroit steel was now rolling over Hitler's arithmetic. For every Sherman lost, 2 more were already loaded on ships in Cherbourg. The panzer commanders knew it. They weren't just fighting men, they were fighting time. And time was now an American weapon. Reports from the U.S. War Department show the logistical miracle in numbers that still defy belief. Between December 22nd and 26th, Patton's Third Army consumed 350,000 gallons of gasoline and received nearly the same back through snow-choked routes patched together overnight. 5,000 trucks, 2,000 jeeps, and 100 bulldozers moved in synchronized chaos every hour, every minute accounted for. The G4 logistics officers later called it the Christmas engine. The Germans, meanwhile, could measure their fuel in barrels, not trucks. Entire battalions were immobilized tanks, used as bunkers vehicles, stripped for parts. The momentum that once crushed Europe was now frozen solid in the snow. And still the American rhythm grew faster. Every hour brought another report: bridge secured, village cleared, road open. The front no longer had direction, it had velocity. Patton himself drove forward to the lead column, standing through the open hatch of his command tank, the snow lashing his face. His orders were clipped, relentless. Keep moving. Through them, not around them. He believed in shock, not the German kind engineered and timed, but human shock, the kind that makes an army forget what fear feels like. As his men pushed closer to Bastogne, the radio intercepts from the German side began to sound like panic. One transmission from the 15th Panzer Grenadiers read, "They are everywhere. We cannot tell where the line begins." Another, captured by Allied Signal Corps, simply repeated the word, "Überrannt," overrun. The precision of the Wehrmacht dissolved into fragments. Units vanished in the snow, entire columns swallowed by smoke. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26th, the lead tank of Lieutenant Charles Bogius's platoon, a Sherman named Cobra King, broke through the last German barricade south of Bastogne. The driver's log recorded the moment with military brevity, encountered enemy fire. Neutralized. Continued forward. In reality, it was chaos. Small arms fire pinged against armor mines, exploded under treads, the air thick with diesel and cordite. Then silence. Ahead, through drifting snow, the ruins of Bastogne appeared, steeples, broken roofs, caved smoke curling from every hole. A group of paratroopers emerged from the haze uniforms, filthy faces black with soot. One of them raised his rifle in salute. Another shouted, "Welcome to Bastogne." That single phrase, shouted through frost and disbelief, became the symbol of reversal. Within an hour, the corridor between Patton's spearhead and the 101st Airborne was secure. The siege was over. The impossible had arrived. The U.S. Signal Corps message, sent at 5:12 p.m., read, "Contact made, Bastogne relieved." The entire Allied command erupted in cheers. Patton didn't. He simply marked the time in his notebook, 1650. Bastogne reached. Then he turned to his aide and said, "Now let's finish the job." The German command collapsed into disbelief. Von Lüttwitz radioed to Berlin. The enemy has accomplished a maneuver that cannot be explained by logic or weather. His fuel depots were gone. His lines shredded his men trapped in pockets they had built themselves. For every tank the Americans lost, the Germans lost 4. For every mile the Germans gained in the opening of the offensive, they were now losing 10. The momentum had inverted a mirror turned upside down. Patton's doctrine was simple movement as weapon. Where the Germans hesitated, he accelerated. Where they fortified, he flanked. His tanks struck from the east, then vanished, and appeared in the west, never static, never predictable. Allied war analysts later described it as kinetic deception. The Germans had been outflanked, outproduced, outsmarted. The contrast was total. The myth of German invincibility against the mathematics of American production, the precision of their generals undone by the improvisation of one man who refused to slow down. The Third Army advanced like a living organism, feeding on its own motion, devouring resistance. Even nature bent to it. The snowstorms that had once shielded the Germans now became their cage. The frozen rivers they thought uncrossable froze solid enough for tanks to pass. By the end of December 26th, the tide of war had officially turned. Bastogne, the impossible fortress, was alive again. And from there, Patton's engines didn't stop. They thundered east, pushing the Wehrmacht back toward the Siegfried Line, each mile a heartbeat closer to the end of the Third Reich. The Germans had believed they were fighting for time, that winter would protect them, that the elements would punish their enemies. But the elements had chosen sides. The storm that had blinded the sky now cleared for the Allied sun. The math had failed. The miracle had taken its place. By the time night fell, the sound of engines echoed deep into the forest, the rhythm of steel, the pulse of inevitability. The men of Bastogne watched the horizon glow with the fires of retreating panzers and whispered one word among themselves: Patton. They had been outnumbered, outgunned, out of everything. But now, for the first time in weeks, they were not out of hope. December 27th, 1944. Dawn broke over Bastogne like an exhale after drowning. The sky was clean again, streaks of pale blue cutting through smoke and frost. The town that had been a ruin, a graveyard, a legend in waiting was alive. The snow no longer swallowed sound, it carried it. The clang of wrenches, the thrum of engines, the quiet murmur of men rebuilding fires. In the streets, Patton's tanks stood like steel statues. Their barrels blackened, their hulls scarred with ice and soot. Paratroopers leaned against them, smoking trading rations for stories. The siege was over, but the war was not. The realization hung in the cold like a second breath. The miracle had bought time, not peace. Patton arrived that morning in his command jeep, the white scarf around his neck snapping in the wind. His boots crushed the snow as he walked through Bastogne's shattered square. The men turned as he passed, some saluted, most just stared. His eyes swept the scene-ruined houses, burned tanks, wounded men wrapped in blankets. He nodded once. "Well done, boys," he said softly. Then louder. "Now let's keep moving." There was no speech, no ceremony. He wasn't a man for reflection. His victory wasn't something to admire. It was a thing to maintain, like momentum itself. But history and his enemies were already acknowledging what had happened. Deep in a bunker near Koblenz, General von Rundstedt sat before a cracked map and said, "It is finished." The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble, was collapsing in real time. The panzers that had once surged like black rivers across Belgium were now stranded out of fuel, out of time. Von Lüttwitz's corps was retreating east in fragments. The German radio net was chaos, half orders, half prayers. The weather that had once shielded them had turned against them. Allied bombers now ruled the sky. Every road they had built toward Antwerp was becoming a graveyard of steel. Even Hitler's own staff dared to whisper the truth that the offensive had not been a bold strike, but a death spasm. In the Führer's headquarters at Adlerhorst, officers read the field reports in silence. Enemy armored columns have reached Bastogne. Third Army advancing. Luftwaffe grounded. Each line a nail driven into the coffin of illusion. One aide recalled hearing Hitler mutter, "Patton moves faster than thought." Meanwhile, in Bastogne, the cost of that movement was written in frozen blood. The dead still lay where they fell, Germans and Americans, both blanketed by snow that made them indistinguishable. Chaplains moved through the wreckage, reading prayers, their voices trembling in the wind. A priest lit candles along the church steps, their flames bending in the cold. One of Patton's men, a corporal from Texas, stood watching the flicker and said, "Looks like the sky came down to apologize." For the survivors of the 101st, the relief was too large to feel. Some slept for 20 hours straight. Others walked through the ruins like strangers, unable to accept that silence didn't mean death anymore. One medic wrote in his diary, "We are alive, but not the same." They had endured a siege that should have erased them, 7 days of isolation, bombardment, frostbite, starvation, and they had emerged unbroken. Not triumphant, but unbroken. Patton, in his own journal, wrote a single sentence that beat us that night: Bastogne was held by guts alone. He knew better than anyone that victory wasn't granted by weather or strategy. It was forced into existence by the refusal to yield. The Third Army had moved faster than humanly possible, not because of engines, but because of belief that no matter the odds, the line would not break. It was a faith so stubborn, it defied physics. The aftermath unfolded like the slow thaw of logic. German high command began issuing orders for withdrawal on every front. The offensive that was meant to divide the Allies had instead united them. Eisenhower's cables to London read enemy's strategic reserves expended. Initiative regained. Montgomery in the north praised Patton publicly, a rarity, calling his maneuver the most astonishing pivot in modern warfare. The British press printed it differently, the man who turned winter into a weapon. And yet, amid the celebration, Patton refused complacency. He visited the wounded, his gloved hand resting briefly on each shoulder. "You did your job," he said. "Now heal fast. We've got a war to finish." To his staff, he said something colder. "The bastards will try again. Let's make sure they never do." Within 48 hours, his tanks were rolling east again. There was no pause, no victory parade, no music, just the grind of gears and the endless road. For the Germans who survived, Bastogne became a word that stung the tongue. Captured diaries from officers spoke of disbelief turned to dread. One read, "We could not understand how they moved through the snow. It was as if the storm served them." Another, written by a wounded sergeant near Foy, said simply, "God was American that week." In Allied intelligence files, the victory was dissected into figures. 76,000 German casualties, 700 tanks destroyed, nearly all of Hitler's Western reserves annihilated. The U.S. Army lost 19,000 men, most in the cold frostbite exposure exhaustion, the kind of losses that don't make headlines. But behind every number was a truth too complex for paper: that willpower had become a weapon as lethal as steel. The turning point wasn't just military, it was moral. The myth of German inevitability, the idea that their precision could outthink chaos, was gone. The Battle of the Bulge, once meant to fracture the Allies, had instead cemented their unity. Bastogne became shorthand for defiance, for the moment when the Western Front refused to bend. The phrase "nuts" crossed languages, oceans, generations. It wasn't just slang, it was doctrine. Patton understood what it meant better than anyone. On the evening of the 27th, as snow began to fall again, he gathered his senior officers in a barn lit by lanterns. The walls trembled with the sound of distant artillery still echoing through the valleys. He raised his glass. "To the men of Bastogne," he said. "They held when holding meant dying. Now we move always forward." No one spoke after. They didn't need to. Outside, the forest was quiet again. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, rebuilt from rubble. The stars returned faint, scattered, impossibly bright. A soldier walking the perimeter that night stopped to look up and whispered to no one. "We made it." But the war wasn't done. The roads ahead led to the Rhine, to the Siegfried Line, to Germany itself. The victory at Bastogne wasn't an ending, it was a pivot point in the turning of the world. In the ruins of a farmhouse at the edge of town, Red Simmons, the same paratrooper who'd survived Marvy, found an old radio that still worked. He turned the dial until he caught a distant voice, a BBC reporter announcing, "Bastogne has been relieved." Red stared into the firelight, half smiling, half numb. He whispered, "About damn time." The broadcast faded under static, but he left the radio on. The crackle of the airwaves was proof the world still existed beyond the snow. By midnight, Patton's convoy was gone, only the tracks remained frozen into the road like veins. The men of Bastogne watched them fade north and east and realized that in some strange way, the man who had saved them was already chasing the next impossible thing. The war would rage for months more. But in that brief, crystalline moment between defeat and dawn, the balance of history had tilted. The German war machine had been forced into retreat not by numbers, but by audacity, by one general's refusal to accept the limits of men or weather. The echo of that realization would carry long after the guns stopped. The snow at Bastogne never melted, it remembered. Beneath every thawed field still hums the echo of engines, the heartbeat of men who refused to die. The world expected silence, but out of that frozen tomb came motion, thunder, defiance. Logic said they would fall, yet belief tore a hole straight through winter itself. Patton didn't just save Bastogne, he bent reality. He made faith mechanical. He turned weather speed and chaos into weapons no doctrine could predict. The Germans called it impossible, and then watched it happen. For the 101st, it was never glory. It was cold hunger pain and the simple refusal to stop breathing. They didn't hold because they could. They held because surrender had no meaning left. History would call it victory. But Bastogne was more than that. It was the moment men proved that courage can outlast logic, that willpower can outlive war. And somewhere in the Ardennes, when the wind cuts through the pines just right, you can still hear it steal on snow, faith against fire, and the sound of the impossible moving forward.